Nori Amaya, co-owner of a popular Washington, D.C. restaurant, was a vibrant presence known for her love of salsa dancing, a passion that earned her the nickname the Salsa Queen. On Halloween night 2009, 38-year-old Nori was in her element. She spent the evening salsa dancing at some of DC's hottest Latin clubs, dressed in a black evening gown and even wearing a festive masquerade mask adorned with peacock feathers. But just 2 days later, that lively spirit was extinguished in the most chilling way. Nori's family found her strangled in her own bed, in what has become one of the capital's most haunting unsolved crimes. Nori Amaya was a well-known figure in DC's nightlife and culinary scene. She co-owned Copy's Organic Restaurant, a cozy Italian eatery, with her brother Carlos. Friends and patrons described Nori as warm and full of life, the kind of person who would greet customers with a hug and make them feel at home. Outside of work, her greatest passion was salsa dancing. By October 2009, Nori was juggling long hours running the restaurant with her nightly dance outings. October 31st, 2009 was a rainy Saturday in D.C., but Nori was determined to enjoy the Halloween festivities. She worked an early shift at Copy's that day, then shared a bottle of wine with her brother at the restaurant's bar before heading out close to midnight. Dressed for a masquerade and excited to dance, Nori made a circuit of her favorite clubs that night. First, she stopped by a DuPont Circle nightclub and then Rumba Cafe, a spot owned by Gustavo Huapala, a man she had been dating. According to later accounts, Nori wasn't her usual upbeat self at Rumba Cafe. Behind her mask, she appeared sad and even asked Gustavo to sit with her, but he was busy working the crowded Halloween party. Feeling upset, Nori slipped out without saying goodbye. From there, she took a taxi to Bravo Bravo, a downtown salsa club, where she met up with her regular dance partner, Israel Salamanca. Normally, Nori might dance the night away, but that night she cut the outing short, reportedly leaving after only about 15 minutes. It was unusual for Nori to leave the dance floor so early, and reportedly she was even seen in tears as she departed the club. Israel escorted Nori to a taxi and watched her ride away, not realizing he'd be the last friend to see her alive. Around 2:30 a.m. in the early hours of November 1st, Nori arrived back at her apartment building, a large complex called the Woodner. If you're one of those people who just listens, you may want to check out the security footage now, as I'm talking about it. That said, there's absolutely nothing earth-shattering in this footage, and it's perhaps paradoxically more interesting for the fact that there's nothing unusual about it. Security camera footage from the lobby captured her entering the building alone. The video shows Nori pausing to speak briefly with someone at the front desk before checking her mailbox and heading toward the elevators. Because it was Halloween night, the lobby was bustling with costumed party-goers returning home, but Nori appeared to be by herself, and no one obvious was following her. That grainy early clip of Nori stepping into the Woodner would be the last known sighting of her. What happened after she reached her 11th floor apartment remains a mystery. Notably, Nori's cell phone did not make it home with her. The next day, a cab driver found her phone left behind in his taxi and turned it in. As a result, when family and friends tried to contact Nori on Sunday, they got no answer. However, those close to her weren't immediately alarmed. Her brother Carlos assumed she might be sleeping off a hangover from Halloween night, but as Sunday turned into Monday with still no word from Nori, concern began to set in. By Monday, November 2nd, Nori Amaya had failed to show up for work at the restaurant for 2 days in a row, an absence that was very out of character. That morning, Carlos Amaya decided to check on his sister in person. He drove to the Woodner and went up to Nori's apartment, but got no response when he knocked. Oddly, he found the door locked, which struck him as strange because Nori often left her door unlocked out of habit, at least during the daytime. Thinking she might simply be sleeping inside, Carlos left, only to return later that evening with their younger sister and a building security guard to get access. Around 9 p.m. on Monday night, the guard unlocked Nori's apartment door, and the siblings entered with a sense of dread. The apartment was dark and quiet, and as they crept into the bedroom and switched on a light, a horrific scene confronted them. Nori was lying lifeless on her bed. Someone had covered her body with her bedsheets or a comforter, almost as if to cloak the crime. It was immediately clear she had been the victim of foul play. Carlos later recalled the jarring moment he realized his sister was dead, crying out as the gravity of the situation flowed over him all at once. The arriving police and paramedics arrived immediately and confirmed Nori was deceased. The scene was officially declared a slaying, and she was found to have been strangled. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was yet to come, something that deeply unsettled even veteran detectives. All 10 of Nori's fingernails had been meticulously cut off. Investigators at the scene were shaken by that bizarre detail. The removal of a victim's fingernails is extraordinarily unusual, and was clearly done intentionally by the perpetrator. Detectives immediately theorized why. Nori had struggled against her attacker. She might have clawed at them and trapped critical DNA evidence under her nails. By cutting off her nails post-mortem, the perp was likely trying to eliminate any chance of forensic evidence under her fingertips. It was a chilling sign that this predator was both calculated and cold-blooded. DC Metropolitan Police launched an intensive investigation into Nori's slaying, but from the outset the case presented perplexing challenges. At the crime scene, detectives found minimal physical evidence. There were no obvious signs of forced entry into the apartment, and no indication of theft. Nori's wallet, credit cards, and other valuables were reportedly untouched. This suggested that robbery was not the motive, and it raised the likelihood that Nori knew the perpetrator and had willingly let them into her home. Indeed, Nori's family firmly believed she would never open her door in the middle of the night to a stranger, especially since she was security conscious living in a big complex. Notably, while Nori was known to leave her door unlocked, as I had previously mentioned, reports imply that this was only something she did during the day. The fact that the door was found locked when Carlos first visited is also puzzling. With no broken locks or forced doors, the initial profile was that the culprit was likely someone in Nori's circle, or at least someone who didn't raise her suspicions. Investigators did uncover one crucial piece of evidence from Nori's body. Despite the nail-clipping ploy, they managed to retrieve an unknown male DNA profile from the scene. The police haven't publicly disclosed where this DNA was found, but it could have been from touch DNA on her clothing or skin. This genetic clue was immediately run through national law enforcement databases, but it didn't match any existing offender profiles. With the DNA unidentified, detectives began collecting voluntary DNA samples from the men in Nori's life. Over the next months, more than 20 individuals who had interacted with Nori were tested, and one by one, each one was ruled out. Meanwhile, detectives meticulously reviewed the surveillance footage from the Woodner apartment complex on the night of Nori's slaying. Unfortunately, because it was Halloween, the video proved to be more frustrating than fruitful. The lobby tapes showed a parade of residents and guests in costumes, many wearing masks, wigs, or face paint, making it extremely difficult to recognize individuals. Investigators couldn't definitively pick out any suspect trailing Nori in that late-night crowd. The surveillance footage essentially hit a dead end due to the Halloween disguises. Police noted that one personal item was missing from Nori's apartment, but they've kept tight-lipped about what that item is. This detail has been deliberately withheld from the public to keep it as knowledge only known to the perpetrator and investigators. If a so-called tipster was to report something related to this item, for instance, it would raise an immediate red flag to intensively investigate that person. Despite extensive police work, the investigation stalled in the absence of a clear suspect. The baffling nature of Nori Amaya's slaying has led to extensive speculation about who could have done it and what the motive might have been. Investigators themselves lean strongly toward the theory that Nori knew the perpetrator. The combination of no forced entry and the apparent comfort the perp had to spend time altering the scene suggests a personal connection, at least according to investigators. Further, there was the fact that her body was covered in a blanket. Criminologists often note that when a victim's body is covered, it can indicate the perpetrator felt remorse for what they had done. One early focus of the investigation was Nori's tumultuous love life. In the months leading up to her death, Nori had been involved with Gustavo Huapala, the Rumba Cafe owner. That relationship had its stresses. Nori had even confided to her brother that she didn't see a future with Gustavo. She also complained about the difficulty of finding a good man and feeling lonely despite her vibrant social life. Some wondered if a jealous lover, ex-partner, or even a scorned romantic rival could have been involved. Notably, there was an odd incident where someone claiming to be Gustavo's wife called Nori at her restaurant shortly before her slaying. But here's the thing. Gustavo wasn't married anymore, and his ex-wife denied ever making the call. Detectives eventually dismissed that strange phone call as an unrelated prank, and Gustavo himself was cleared. Gustavo's account and others placed him elsewhere during the critical hours, and police have stated they do not consider him a suspect. Further, he voluntarily gave a DNA sample and voluntarily submitted to a polygraph and was fully cooperative with the investigation. But I want to come back to that weird phone call for a moment before we move on. This call seems very odd to me, though, and I do have to question if the actual perpetrator may have put someone up to making the call. It suggests to me that there was someone out there who may have wanted to break up Gustavo and Nori, or at least put some significant doubts into Nori's mind. That suggests to me that this unknown caller may offer a substantial clue, which should perhaps have been investigated more thoroughly. That said, it's an active and ongoing investigation, so it's possible that investigators saying it isn't related is actually an investigative tactic in and of itself. With known friends and boyfriends ruled out, attention shifted to other possibilities. The Woodner is an enormous complex, home to roughly 2,000 people, and has its own security staff and maintenance crews. An insider with knowledge of the building might have known of Nori, or even interacted with her casually. Nori was outgoing and might have made acquaintances in the elevators or lobby. It's conceivable someone living there developed an unhealthy fixation on her. Such a person could easily follow her to her door without standing out, especially on Halloween night, and might know about her habit of leaving the door unlocked. Online sleuths have speculated about the role of a security guard or other staff, since they had access to master keys and would understand the surveillance system. However, no evidence pointing to a specific employee has ever been made public. It remains an open question whether the perp had legitimate access to the building or was an intruder who tailgated in behind someone else that night. And that's another important factor to mention here since it was Halloween. This would have been the ideal time for anyone to tailgate into the Woodner, despite the usual security. There is also the grim possibility of a serial predator who saw an opportunity. The Halloween timing, being inconvenient for surveillance, could have been less than coincidental. Investigators haven't linked Nori's case to any others, but the fact that her fingernails were removed suggests the attacker may have at least been an aspiring serial offender. At this point, though, in my view, it's only a matter of time before the perpetrator is caught and there's justice for Nori and her family. For regular viewers, the fact that there's DNA on this cold case and all leads have dried up probably means you know what I'm going to discuss next. Genetic genealogy could be the key to finally cracking this case wide open. Traditional forensic DNA testing has already produced an unidentified male DNA profile from the crime scene, which is an extremely valuable lead. While this DNA hasn't matched any entries in law enforcement databases, that doesn't mean the suspect is untraceable. This is where genetic genealogy comes in. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which looks for exact matches in criminal databases, genetic genealogy uses consumer DNA data to identify potential relatives. By comparing the unknown DNA to thousands of samples submitted by ordinary people researching their family trees, genealogists can build out family lines. If the person responsible has any biological relatives who submitted their DNA to a genealogy site, the net can then close. Using this process, they can eventually narrow the possibilities down to a small number of individuals, often even to just one person. From there, investigators can obtain a sample of the suspect's DNA, often surreptitiously, and confirm the connection prior to making an arrest. It's not clear to me at present if Nori's case has been referred out for genetic genealogical testing. Given that her family is so involved in advocating for her, though, I speculate that it's only a matter of time before this is done. I hope that the next time I mention Nori's case, it'll be in an update segment talking about how the perpetrator has been brought to justice. Valentine's Day is usually a time for love and hope, but in 1978 it delivered something much darker. On that morning, a jogger made a gruesome discovery along a lonely road in Otay, California: the partially burned body of a teenage girl. The shocking find left authorities with a nameless victim and almost no clues, a mystery that remains unsolved decades later. She was small in build, around 5'1" and under 90 pounds, and wore blue denim overalls with a floral patterned white top, and notably, she had no shoes or socks on her feet. She was noted to be somewhere in her middle to late teen years, with the identification of her age being potentially hindered by her small stature. The girl had brown hair tied in a ponytail, and her right ear was slightly malformed, a distinctive detail that could have helped identify her if someone had reported her missing. The medical examiner estimated she had been deceased for about 2 days before the discovery. Investigators noted more disturbing clues. Her body had been set on fire after death, with most of the burns concentrated on her torso, while her face and limbs remained unscathed. In fact, the charring was heaviest around her lower abdomen, and her fingertips were burnt, likely an effort by the perpetrator to destroy evidence or hinder identification. They also observed the girl's left eye was swollen shut, her left cheek was bruised, and a front tooth was cracked in half. This indicated she had been beaten, perhaps over a prolonged period. An autopsy toxicology screen revealed a lethal amount of the painkiller Demerol in her body. Investigators concluded this overdose was the likely cause of death, firmly establishing the case as a slaying by poisoning. The medical examiner also noted the girl had extensive dental work, including a fairly recent root canal, which indicated she had received good dental care during her life. Investigators compared her dental records against missing persons databases, but found no match. Given the good state of her dental care, the authorities expected to be able to at least identify the girl quickly, but unfortunately, this wouldn't be the case. The crime received little media coverage in 1978, just a brief mention in a local paper, so it didn't generate many tips from the public. Later efforts to spark recognition, such as releasing an updated facial reconstruction in 2014 and highlighting the case in media, also brought no breakthroughs. Unfortunately, all sources list that no DNA is available in the case, and it's unclear where her remains presently are, but I'll get back to that in a moment. A number of theories have been proposed in this case. Some suggest the perpetrator was someone in the victim's life, possibly a family member or caregiver. If she came from an unstable home, it's conceivable that her own parent or guardian administered the fatal poisoning and then dumped her body, never reporting her missing. This would explain why no one came forward to identify her. The very people who should have sought her were responsible for her death. However, some have suggested the fact that she had good extensive dental work is contrary to this claim. After all, it does seem unlikely that a family who was treating their daughter in such a cruel way would at the same time be paying for extensive dental treatments. Another possibility is that she was a runaway or transient hitchhiker who fell prey to a dangerous individual on the road. In the 1970s, many teens hitchhiked, and some unfortunately encountered violent predators. The Otay Jane Doe could have left home voluntarily and then met someone who ultimately administered the lethal dosage. The brutal but hasty nature of the crime, signs of beating, an overdose, and a clumsy attempt to burn the evidence, suggests an impulsive act rather than a well-planned act. If she was far from her hometown, it would also make it harder to link her to any missing persons report. Another theory suggests that she may have fallen into a trafficking ring and been moved as far away from her home state as possible. Under this theory, she was perhaps a runaway who was taken advantage of. This theory explains why she had good dental care, and also why no one came forward to report her missing locally. It's very possible that another parallel case exists somewhere for this missing teenager under her actual name. Like with many cold cases such as this, that haven't received much attention at all, it's possible that word of the Otay Jane Doe simply hasn't reached the right people. Perhaps the next steps to bringing justice in this case would be to exhume her body, if it exists, and send her remains off to a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory. If a DNA sample can be obtained, genetic genealogy could locate this teenager's parents. Given the situation, it's possible that locating the parents could solve both her identity and the crime itself. As for now, the Otay Jane Doe remains one of the numerous unidentified victims of crime for whom justice has been so elusive. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with that regular reminder to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Also check out the Patreon if you want to support my work further, and also get your name on the shout-out page. In April 2019, a bush plane droned over the vast subarctic wilderness of Canada's Northwest Territories. Far below, a lone figure and 3 dogs stood beside a remote campsite on the shore of Rolfe Lake. The pilot's passing glimpse of this isolated camp would be the last time anyone saw 63-year-old Glenn Field alive. Glenn was an experienced outdoorsman, a loner who fully embraced life in the wild. He had moved to the Northwest Territories in 2018, determined to make the bush his permanent home. In the fall of that year, he had a charter plane drop him off at Rolfe Lake. This is a remote area only accessible by plane about 100 miles northeast of Yellowknife, the only city in this isolated region. He was dropped off along with his 3 German Shepherd dogs and enough provisions to last the winter. He understood the dangers. Decades earlier, Glenn had lost several toes to frostbite during a solo winter expedition. Nonetheless, he remained determined to live off the land. Indeed, he endured the brutal winter of 2018 to 2019. A passing pilot spotted Field and his dogs at the lakeside camp in April 2019, confirming he was alive and well as the ice began to thaw. Sometime after that April 2019 sighting, Glenn Field vanished without a trace. He never arrived back in Yellowknife, nor did he make his usual periodic check-ins with acquaintances in town as the summer passed. When Field failed to appear or contact anyone by the fall of 2019, those who knew him grew alarmed. The RCMP were alerted, and on October 11, 2019, police issued a public appeal for any information on Field's whereabouts. A missing person investigation was soon underway in the unforgiving terrain where he was last seen. Searchers eventually reached Glenn's campsite later in 2019, only to find it deserted. The camp was neatly packed up, with no garbage or personal items left behind. Just a few tree stumps remained as evidence that he had been there. Nothing indicated when he had left or which direction he went. Crucially, Field's gray canoe was gone, along with all his gear, including his tent, axe, rifle, and his satellite phone. The 3 dogs he arrived with were also nowhere to be found, and there was no trace of them either. As mentioned, he had carried a satellite phone for emergencies, yet no distress call was ever sent from it. All signs suggested he had set off on his planned journey home, but somewhere along the way something had gone very wrong. Despite extensive search efforts, no clear trace of Field was found in the vast wilderness. In the summer of 2020, RCMP conducted further aerial searches and urged anyone traveling in the area to watch for any sign of Field's equipment or dogs. On August 24, 2020, searchers did discover some scattered equipment believed to belong to him near Rolfe Lake. However, there was still no sign of Glenn himself, nor of his canoe or the German shepherds. With no leads to follow, active search operations were called off in late 2020, leaving the mystery unresolved. The leading theory is that Glenn Field met with a fatal accident during his journey back toward civilization. His brother, Wayne Field, believes Glenn likely capsized his canoe while trying to trek back to Yellowknife with the dogs. A drowning in frigid, wind-swept waters could have taken his life in an instant, even given his expertise. Such a mishap would also explain why neither Glenn, nor his canoe, nor any of the 3 dogs were ever found. Another possibility is that he succumbed to an injury or exhaustion on land before he could find help. He had skis with him to traverse spring ice and snow, so it's conceivable he fell through ice or was hurt while portaging between lakes. Alone in the bush, any serious misfortune could turn deadly without anyone to rescue him. There is no evidence of foul play in this case, and given the remoteness of the area, that scenario is highly unlikely. However, that hasn't stopped speculation that a human predator could have seen this isolated man as a viable target. That said, Glenn was fairly heavily armed, and also had 3 tough dogs with him, so he wouldn't have been an easy target. The presence of his 3 German shepherds would have made it difficult for anyone to ambush him, given the dogs would have been alerted to any camp intruder by scent alone. The authorities also investigated whether he disappeared intentionally to start a new life. Glenn Field was, by all accounts, a bit of an unusual guy to say the least, so him packing it all up and trekking to a new location isn't impossible. He's also the sort of person who would go out of contact with absolutely everyone in his life for extended periods. However, after extensive investigations and following some leads in British Columbia and Canada, the authorities turned up no trace of him and ruled out the idea. In the end, it appears to me that the simplest explanation is the most likely in this scenario, and he very likely had an accident and perished. Glenn took a big risk by heading out into the wilderness alone, and as a very experienced woodsman, he was aware of these challenges. We don't know exactly what the travel corridor was for Glenn's trip back to Yellowknife, but the city is exactly 93 miles from Lake Rolfe. Let's assume for a moment that the travel corridor width was 30 miles, given that there are no trails whatsoever in this area. This would mean that the authorities would have had to investigate approximately 3,000 square miles of densely forested terrain for any sign of Glenn. Putting the math aside for a moment, finding any concrete evidence of Glenn was a virtually impossible task for investigators. This was compounded by the fact that no one even knew when he disappeared for certain. That said, of course, all this ambiguity could be seen to be in favor of the non-accident related theories as well, but Occam's razor definitely applies in this situation. That said, the accident theory does leave some unanswered questions, like why he never used his satellite phone to send a distress call. In my view, this can likely be best explained by a sudden accident on the water, where there would be no opportunity to make any sort of call. In April 2022, 3 years after he disappeared, a Yellowknife court found Glenn to be legally deceased. Officially, however, the RCMP still consider the case open until concrete proof of Glenn's fate is discovered. The vast wilderness may forever hold its secrets. Field's final resting place could lie at the bottom of a lake, or somewhere lost in those woods, never to be found. It was a warm spring evening in rural Winton, California, a golden early summer night with the sun still lingering in the sky. 15-year-old Vanessa Dawn Smith stepped out of her house for her usual evening walk, a routine she often shared with her mother. But on May 31st, 1997, Vanessa went out alone, carrying the simple walking stick she liked to bring for a sense of security. She promised to be back before dark. Her mother watched as Vanessa headed down Winton Way toward the nearby almond orchards, not realizing it would be the last time she saw her daughter. Vanessa was a shy 15-year-old growing up in a close-knit Mennonite family in Winton. She loved spending time with her family and church. Almost every night, she and her mother Beverly would take a walk together through their rural neighborhood. The night Vanessa vanished was one of the few times she went walking alone, simply because her mom was busy with chores after dinner. The very day she disappeared, Vanessa had enjoyed a school picnic celebrating the end of the year. After the picnic, Vanessa had dinner with her parents and then wanted to go on her regular walk. Eager to be outdoors, Vanessa told her mom she would take a short walk by herself and be back before sunset. Around 7 p.m., she headed out along Winton Way and then turned onto Mercedes Avenue to make her usual loop through the orchards back home. It was broad daylight in their quiet neighborhood, and the route was peaceful and familiar. It was a rural road, lined with orchards and the occasional farmhouse, not a place where anyone imagined danger lurking. When dusk arrived and Vanessa still hadn't returned, her parents knew something was wrong. Art and Beverly Smith rushed out to search the route. As they neared a bend in the road, their hearts dropped. On the roadside lay Vanessa's wooden walking stick. They shouted her name into the empty dusk, but no answer came. The Smiths immediately called the Merced County Sheriff's Department, and thankfully they didn't simply dismiss her as a runaway. Officers and neighbors joined the search, combing the area with flashlights into the night, but no additional clues turned up. No neighbors heard screams or saw any suspicious vehicle. The community was left shaken and baffled, and authorities had little to go on beyond the fact that foul play was almost certain. All that remained was that lonely walking stick, a silent, inanimate witness to whatever had happened to her. Investigators treated Vanessa's disappearance as an abduction from the very start. They did consider the chance of a random stranger attack, but the circumstances seemed to point to someone she knew. Those close to Vanessa noted that she would have been unlikely to willingly get into a stranger's car. It was more plausible that a familiar face had approached her. The Merced County Sheriff's Office stated that they believed Vanessa was likely abducted by an acquaintance, someone local who knew her routine. Detectives theorized that Vanessa might have let her guard down if a trusted person stopped to talk to her, giving the abductor a chance to grab her before she could react. Police looked at local offenders and suspicious characters, but found no links to Vanessa's case. No solid suspect ever emerged in the initial investigation, and despite extensive searches and interviews, the trail went cold. A possible break in the case finally came decades later when in 2019, an elderly Winton couple came forward with new information. Around 7 p.m., on the night Vanessa vanished, they saw a teenage girl with a walking stick on Mercedes Avenue, almost certainly Vanessa. More importantly, on their way home via a different road, they witnessed an incident they described as suspicious that same evening. They admitted fear kept them silent until then, but they ultimately gave a detailed statement to authorities. While the specifics remain confidential, investigators say this late testimony supports the theory that a local individual was involved and gives hope that the case can still be solved. Armed with this information, the Sheriff's Department renewed its commitment to cracking the case. To this day, the question of who took Vanessa and why still haunts Winton. Investigators suspect that someone in the community knows the truth, and they have repeatedly urged anyone with information to come forward. In the years since Vanessa disappeared, her story has been kept alive by her loved ones and the community. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted and is periodically revisited by local media on anniversaries. The case is still open, and authorities continue to urge tips from the public, and they insist the case isn't closed and say they'll continue investigating until Vanessa is found. Notably, a $50,000 reward is on offer for information leading to a resolution. One of the more unsettling theories surrounding Vanessa Dawn Smith's disappearance centers on the idea that someone in the local community knows exactly what happened. And this isn't just my crazy speculative theory, since we actually have strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that this could be the case. When that elderly couple came forward with information they had withheld for 22 years, they mentioned that fear was a major factor in not initially coming forward. This couple may just be incredibly cowardly, since we don't know all the details. However, the idea is chilling, that someone so dangerous, so deeply feared, could scare witnesses into silence for such a serious crime. It was an ordinary summer evening on June 26, 2025. 29-year-old Rachel Dawson, a devoted fiancée and caregiver, told her family she was stepping out for a quick walk near her rural home in Irving, Kentucky. When Rachel didn't return or answer her phone, her worried fiancé, Caleb Thompson, tracked her cell phone to a Red Roof Inn about 30 miles away in Winchester. Thompson and other family members rushed to the motel and alerted authorities, who arrived with sirens blaring. Officers raced inside, bracing for the worst, and inside one of the motel rooms, they found Rachel. The young woman who had been full of life just hours before was now lying unresponsive on the floor. Paramedics and police could do nothing. Rachel Dawson was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial indications pointed to a substance overdose, which baffled her loved ones. Rachel had no history of usage and was even known to be fearful of illicit substances. Upon further digging, the motel room had been rented by a 44-year-old man named Brian Epperson, who was nowhere to be found when police arrived. Court records later confirmed Epperson had booked that room, and when officers tracked him down, they discovered meth in his truck. Epperson was promptly arrested on drug possession charges, while detectives sent Rachel's body for an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. From the start, Rachel's family doubted that her death was an accident. They knew she would never voluntarily use meth. They also had no idea who Brian Epperson was or how she would have crossed paths with him. Epperson, 44, worked as a home improvement contractor in central Kentucky, a job that often put him in contact with new people in their homes. When police apprehended him, they quickly learned that this was not the first time Epperson had been linked to a suspicious death. In fact, Epperson was already facing a charge in a separate but eerily similar case, the overdose death of 32-year-old Kristen Morris in May 2025. Morris was found unresponsive at a rental cabin in Powell County on May 31st, with Epperson present at the scene. Her toxicology report later revealed an astronomically high level of meth in her system, nearly 300 times a typical fatal overdose. Disturbingly, beyond the overdose investigations, Epperson has also been accused of other predatory behavior. In July 2025, he was charged with video voyeurism in an unrelated case after an ex-girlfriend discovered a hidden camera in her bedroom. Police say Epperson had given the woman a digital clock containing a secret recording device, and a search of his phone uncovered illicit footage that he had secretly recorded. This revelation painted a picture of a man with dangerous, obsessive tendencies, someone who was willing to violate others' privacy and safety in deeply invasive ways. As detectives dug into Epperson's background, a chilling pattern began to emerge. In both Rachel's and Morris's deaths, investigators recovered unusual gelatin capsules filled with meth. This method that suggested the victims had been deliberately dosed with lethal quantities of the substance. Perhaps most striking, a review of Epperson's phone and online activity yielded evidence of planning. Investigators discovered that he had recently searched the internet for overdose deaths, and they found an Amazon receipt for the purchase of empty pill capsules. In other words, it appeared Epperson had researched how to fatally overdose someone and had acquired the tools to do it. When questioned, he claimed he did not know the women were dead and did not admit to spiking the capsules. With two cases now linked, authorities also revisited a third mysterious death: the November 2024 overdose of a woman named Hillary Davis in Lexington. Davis had been found dead in a hotel room under similar conditions, and detectives now identified a tie between Davis and Epperson. Although Davis's case had initially been treated as an accidental overdose, it's now part of the broader investigation into Epperson's activities. Police publicly named Brian Epperson as the primary suspect in all three women's deaths and began exploring the possibility that there are even more victims beyond these cases. Winchester police have put out a public call for anyone who has ever interacted with Brian Epperson to come forward with information. Kentucky State Police have similarly urged families of any overdose victims with possible ties to Epperson to contact authorities. The full extent of the alleged crimes of Brian Epperson remain unknown at present. It's also important to remember that Brian Epperson remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you not to hit like or subscribe, and advising you that you definitely shouldn't hit that notification bell. Just kidding. Hit all the usual stuff, please, and thank you, and maybe check out the Patreon as well. Anyway, let's get back to business. For over 3 decades, a mystery haunted the city of Garden Grove, California. On a quiet night in May 1987, 23-year-old Shannon Lloyd was found brutally slain in the house where she rented a room. The discovery of her lifeless body, evidence of a violent struggle and a life cut short, sent shockwaves through the community and left police puzzled and desperate for answers. Who would do this to a young mother in her own home, and would the perpetrator ever be brought to justice? Those questions lingered for decades, until a remarkable breakthrough in forensic science finally cracked the case wide open. Shannon was a mother to a young son and had a steady boyfriend who often visited her. She lived in a rented room on Donna Lane in Garden Grove, an Orange County suburb where she was striving to build a good life for herself and her kid. By all accounts, Shannon was a devoted mother who was just trying her best, making the violent end to her life all the more heartbreaking. Late on May 21st, 1987, the unthinkable happened. Shannon's roommate, a 70-year-old man who shared the house, found her slain shortly before midnight. Panic ensued as he rushed to a neighbor's home to call the police and report the horror he had discovered. When officers arrived, they found a grim scene. Shannon had been indecently assaulted and strangled to death in her own room. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, and nothing of value appeared to be missing, which immediately deepened the mystery. It seemed that Shannon had either willingly let her perpetrator into the house, or perhaps knew the person who did this to her. Crucially, in 1987, forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy, so investigators didn't have today's powerful genetic tools at their disposal. With limited technology and no eyewitnesses, they had to rely on traditional detective work, which unfortunately yielded no answers at the time. Detectives worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the act. They canvassed the neighborhood and interviewed everyone who knew Shannon, from her boyfriend to local acquaintances. Neighbors told police that while Shannon was mostly friendly and kind, there had been occasional visitors who raised eyebrows. One neighbor mentioned that some rough-looking men would occasionally stop by. On a few occasions, police had even been called to the house prior to the attack, though the reasons for those visits remained unclear, at least to the public. All of these details gave investigators leads to chase, but none led to an immediate suspect. Despite the thorough investigation, the case frustratingly remained unsolved. Within a short time, it went cold. A terrifying predator was on the loose, and no one knew who he was, or if he would strike again. Then, in 1989, another tragedy struck in Orange County that would later prove to be connected. On February 19, 1989, the body of 27-year-old Renee Cuevas was discovered along a road near the now-closed El Toro Marine Corps Air Station in Irvine. Renee had been slain under strikingly similar circumstances. Like Shannon's case, Renee's also went unsolved, but investigators took note of the eerie resemblance between the two crimes. It wasn't until 2003 that a crucial clue finally linked the two slayings. Forensic scientists at the Orange County Crime Lab re-examined DNA evidence from both crime scenes and made a startling discovery. The DNA profile from Shannon Lloyd's perpetrator matched the person who had slain Renee. In other words, the same unknown man had committed both crimes. This revelation meant a serial predator had been at large in Orange County since the late 1980s, responsible for taking two young women's lives. Armed with this knowledge, authorities finally had a trail to follow, but the perp's identity was still a mystery. The DNA profile was uploaded to the National Criminal Database, but it didn't match any known offender at the time. The case remained cold, but investigators were now more determined than ever, knowing that solving either woman's slaying would solve both. By the late 2010s, a revolutionary investigative tool emerged in forensic science: genetic genealogy. This technique gained national fame in 2018 for helping identify the original Night Stalker, proving that even decades-old DNA could lead to a name by tracing family trees. In 2021, 34 years after Shannon's life was taken, Orange County's investigative genealogy unit turned its attention to the DNA from her case. Using advanced DNA analysis and family tree mapping, they identified a possible suspect, Reuben Smith. The name meant nothing to the original detectives, but it was about to unravel the whole mystery. Smith had lived in Orange County in the 1980s, not far from where the slayings occurred, before eventually moving to Nevada. Digging into his past, detectives discovered he had a history of violence. In July 1998, more than a decade after Shannon's slaying, Reuben Smith was arrested in Las Vegas for attempting to end the life of a woman after an indecent assault. That victim heroically fought off her attacker and survived, later recalling the evil she sensed in him and how she knew she had to fight for her life. Although Smith was charged for that 1998 attack, the case never went to trial. The charges were eventually dismissed, and he walked free. However, during that arrest, Las Vegas authorities collected a DNA sample from Smith, a sample that would turn out to be the key to solving Shannon's case. And as expected, this would of course crack Renee's case open as well. While it never ended up in any databases, it was stored by the Las Vegas cops. Once Smith's name surfaced through genetic genealogy, investigators pulled his 1998 DNA sample from storage and compared it to the DNA from the crime scenes. It was a perfect match, conclusively tying Reuben Smith to both slayings. The mystery of who ended the life of Shannon Lloyd was solved. It was the same man who had eluded justice all those years while leaving a trail of violence from Orange County to Las Vegas. Reuben Smith would never face a jury for his crimes, and, given the platform we're on, let's just say that he carried out the penalty for a capital offense on himself in July 1999. His grim end meant he escaped justice before anyone realized the full enormity of what he had done. For the families of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, learning the identity was a bittersweet revelation. On one hand, they finally knew who was responsible and that he could never hurt anyone else. On the other, Smith's death meant there would be no criminal trial, no opportunity to see him held accountable in court. Still, the resolution brought a measure of closure that had been denied for so long. Shannon's brother expressed gratitude for the detectives and forensic experts who never gave up on his sister's case, and he took comfort that the truth was finally known. Likewise, Renee Cuevas's relatives thanked law enforcement for their persistence and said that knowing the perpetrator's name brought some peace to their family. Investigators have also begun looking into the possibility that Smith had other victims during his years in California and Nevada, an open question they continue to pursue. Right now, though, no other crimes have been confirmed, though the authorities have confirmed they are investigating him as a potential serial perpetrator. That said, I find it difficult to believe that Reuben Smith struck twice in the late 80s, then attempted to do the same thing in 1998, with no attacks in between. Generally, these sorts of predators are emboldened when they get away with it to the level that Smith did. Notably, he wasn't even a suspect in the case of Shannon or Renee, and had never been interviewed or taken in for questioning. Further, it's somewhat suspicious that he took the approach that he did in 1999, unless he thought there was credible evidence out there that could turn up further victims. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg saw one of history's strangest epidemics, a dancing plague in which dozens of people danced compulsively in the streets for weeks on end. Contemporary reports describe the sufferers flailing their arms and convulsing uncontrollably, faces dripping with sweat and feet bleeding through their shoes. These weren't joyous revelers, but ordinary citizens seized by a mysterious compulsion, and some danced themselves to exhaustion or even death as crowds watched in disbelief. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa suddenly stepped into a Strasbourg street and began dancing without rest, as if entranced. Within days, dozens of others had joined her, caught up in the same unexplainable urge to dance. The dancing epidemic spread to as many as 400 people, all swaying and twirling in a trance-like state. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some reportedly suffered fatal strokes or heart attacks as the marathon dancing went on and on. The strange episode persisted into September, shocking the city's authorities and baffling all who witnessed it. Strasbourg's city leaders were alarmed by this bizarre plague and struggled to find a remedy. At first, they consulted the town's physicians, who declared the dance to be a natural illness caused by overheated blood. Under the medieval humoral understanding of medicine, an excess of hot blood needed to be expelled from the body. Following this advice, the authorities encouraged the afflicted to continue dancing the sickness out. The idea was that if the sufferers danced continuously, the fever of the dance would burn itself out. This well-intentioned cure, however, backfired horribly. The sight of dozens of people dancing madly in public only fueled the town's superstition. Many onlookers believed the dancers were victims of St. Vitus's curse, a divine punishment forcing sinners to dance, and they feared that they could be next. In the fervor, even more people joined in the compulsive dance, swept up by what we might now call crowd psychology. One later chronicle claimed that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people a day were dying from strokes, heart failure, or exhaustion, and the city authorities realized their mistake. Instead of encouraging dancing, they now banned all forms of shimmying and shaking in Strasbourg. Finally, in late August, officials gathered the remaining afflicted dancers, loaded them into wagons, and sent them to a shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby mountains. According to reports, priests at the shrine performed a special ritual to cure the dancers. The exhausted men and women were given small crosses to hold and made to wear red shoes painted with holy crosses on the soles. They were led around a wooden effigy of St. Vitus, while priests chanted prayers and sprinkled holy water and consecrated oil. This act of devotion, combined with the distance from the public eye, seemed to break whatever spell had gripped them. Word soon spread that St. Vitus had forgiven the sufferers, and the dance mania gradually subsided. By early September 1518, the plague had finally run its course, and the city fell quiet, left to wonder what exactly had just happened. For all the relief at its end, one question remained. What caused this bizarre outbreak? Despite becoming the most well-known dancing mania, the 1518 incident was far from an isolated case. In fact, outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing had occurred in Europe before, especially in the Rhine River region. A particularly large eruption in 1374 saw people in dozens of towns convulsing in dance until they collapsed. However, there are documented cases going back to the 10th and 11th centuries in what is now Germany and Italy. Yet the Strasbourg episode of 1518 was the last and best documented of these strange events, and even in its own time people struggled to explain it. Contemporary observers offered both supernatural and natural theories. Many among the pious believed it was the work of divine wrath or demonic possession. The curse of St. Vitus was a primary suspect, which is why so many victims and their families turned to prayer and saintly intercession. Meanwhile, doctors and city officials dismissed otherworldly causes and blamed physical or psychological ones, such as an excess of hot blood overwhelming the brain. The famed physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg a few years later, even put forward an eccentric theory that the plague began as a kind of ruse. He claimed Frau Trophea had feigned her affliction to embarrass her husband, and that other women began dancing to thumb their noses at their own husbands. While his explanation now seems absurd, and was likely even then a minority view, it at least shifted the blame from angry saints and demons toward human psychology. In truth, no consensus existed at the time. The people of 1518 were grasping for answers to an event that must have felt as inexplicable as it was terrifying. In modern times, historians and scientists have continued to puzzle over the dancing plague of 1518. Several hypotheses have been proposed, but only one has gained broad acceptance. One suggestion is food poisoning, the idea that villagers might have consumed bread made from rye tainted with ergot, a fungus that can produce hallucinations and convulsions. Notably, this theory was once widely accepted by academics as the likely cause of the event. However, this theory is now largely discounted since ergot poisoning renders individuals bedridden after an initial burst of energy. This, of course, doesn't fit with people dancing for months on end. Another theory claims that the dancers were members of a heretical religious sect or cult engaging in ecstatic ritual. However, there's no direct evidence for any secret cult involvement, and this idea remains speculative and not widely supported by historians. The most widely accepted explanation for the 1518 dancing plague is that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. Essentially, it was a mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and pervasive fear. Strasbourg in 1518 was a community under enormous strain. The region had been struck by a series of bad harvests and famine, and was stalked by diseases like smallpox and the recently arrived syphilis. Facing hunger and illness, people also shared a deep-seated cultural superstition, a belief that Saint Vitus could punish sinners by making them dance uncontrollably. In a state of heightened anxiety, one person's spontaneous dancing could unconsciously set off a chain reaction. Modern psychologists now accept that in certain contexts, groups of people can exhibit physical symptoms with no obvious physical cause. In 1518, the citizens of Strasbourg arguably experienced just such a phenomenon. The first dancer, Frau Trophea, might have been the spark, and the city's collective stress and belief in the curse of St. Vitus was the tinder. As the fear spread, dozens of others essentially tranced themselves into the same hysterical dance. The fact that the sufferers truly couldn't control their movements, yet later recovered, aligns with what we now understand about psychosomatic disorders fueled by stress and expectation. In other words, the dancing plague was likely a massive stress-induced psychosis that spread by example and suggestion through an anxious community. That said, while this hypothesis has gained widespread acceptance, it hasn't yet been definitively proven. In fact, over the centuries, a number of proposed causes have reached consensus-level understanding, only to go out of fashion. If you asked an educated person 500 years ago, they would have almost certainly talked about overheated blood. Fast forward to 50 years ago, and the modern-day equivalents were talking about rye bread and ergot. Now here we are in the present day, and mass psychogenic illness is the present consensus amongst scholars. Perhaps in another 50 years, it'll be something different entirely. On May 19, 1996, beneath the span of the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, England, police discovered a young man's lifeless body on the rocky banks of the river below. His death, tragic and obscure, marked the beginning of an enduring mystery, which has now gone on for almost 30 years, despite the authorities believing this would be easy to solve. This case comes with a twist. The Bristol John Doe was found carrying a photograph of himself. Early morning joggers stumbled across the grim scene, alerting police immediately. Officers quickly deduced the man likely fell from the bridge, either intentionally or by accident. Physically, the John Doe was described as Caucasian, aged somewhere between 25 and 35, standing around 6 feet tall, with blue eyes and short, light brown hair. He wore simple clothing, a black leather jacket, dark sweatshirt, blue Lee Riders jeans, and brown boots, all of which was typical attire for a young adult in 1996. However, the belongings he carried painted a far more complex portrait of who he might have been. With him was a handwritten cardboard sign that read, quote, "Sleeping rough, thank you." Beside his body lay a black sleeping bag, which together with the sign was a good indication he was homeless. The additional items he carried appeared to confirm that this was the case. He carried personal grooming items, including disposable razors, deodorant, and a toothbrush, suggesting he took pride in his appearance, despite challenging circumstances. More intriguing were several other items that spoke volumes about his personality and possible interests. The John Doe possessed multiple maps, including a guide labeled Euro Hike Adventure, indicating possible extensive travels or an active interest in exploring. There was also a pack of silk-cut cigarettes and a tin whistle, raising the theory he might have bussed to survive, entertaining passers-by for spare change. It wasn't difficult to investigators to imagine that he placed the sign out to solicit donations while playing music. He also carried an interesting array of books which offered more insight into his life. Among them were a Batman comic anthology, a well-used Bible, and a copy of Thomas More's philosophical classic, Utopia. The battered copy of Utopia bore a library stamp reading West Glamorgan County Council. This suggested he may have passed through, or perhaps even originated from, the Swansea region of Wales. The blend of books spoke to a thoughtful, perhaps idealistic individual searching for meaning while also seeking escape in stories. Yet, investigators were most haunted by a passport-sized photograph he kept. Police believed it depicted John Doe himself at a younger age. The image showed a youthful man, possibly late teens or early 20s, with slightly longer hair and a more hopeful demeanor. Disturbingly, the photograph was found in a student-style ID holder, its identifying details deliberately scratched off. Whoever he was, it seemed that John Doe had consciously sought anonymity. The police conducted extensive searches for his identity, sharing the photo and information nationally. They checked missing person databases across the UK and even Europe, considering he may have been a foreign traveler or tourist. However, despite all these efforts, no match was found. With no family or friends stepping forward to claim him, the trail quickly went cold. Within weeks, John Doe's body was buried quietly, marked by nothing more than a case number. As the years passed, theories began to emerge about his origins and fate. Some believed he was a homeless man whose identity faded from society's radar, possibly someone estranged from family or struggling with mental health issues. This theory aligns with his transient lifestyle and the signs of hardship he carried. Perhaps he had deliberately left behind a previous life, erasing connections that might have brought people forward after his death. A second theory, however, suggests he might have been a former student or academic who had become disillusioned or lost. The philosophical book, Utopia, in particular, suggests a young man wrestling with ideas of society, fulfillment, or happiness. The deliberate removal of his personal details from the student ID could hint at someone intentionally severing ties to his past and seeking a new start. Another compelling possibility was that John Doe originated from outside England, perhaps continental Europe. Investigators noted his features suggested possible German or Dutch heritage, and the traveling gear and maps he carried raised the likelihood of a backpacker exploring Britain. Poor cross-border communication in the 1990s could have meant his disappearance was reported in his home country, never reaching British authorities. Questions also remain around the exact circumstances of his death. Police found no evidence of violence or robbery. His belongings remained undisturbed, suggesting he did it himself or that there was an accident. It's been suggested he might have visited the site out of curiosity or contemplation, only to slip and fall due to wet conditions. Unfortunately, the true events of that night remain a complete mystery. Despite the lack of any indications of violence, the homeless are much more likely to encounter violence than the general population. It does remain a possibility that the bridge, in essence, was used as a cover-up for a very serious crime in this case. Again, though, this is speculative given the lack of concrete evidence. Renewed attention in recent years, however, has brought fresh hope. In 2021, the nonprofit group Locate International reopened the case. They commissioned a modern forensic artist to create an updated facial reconstruction, digitally aging the younger photograph to reflect his appearance in 1996. This reconstruction was shared widely in the media, bringing renewed public interest to the long-forgotten case. Investigators reached out specifically to communities who frequented Bristol's streets in the mid-90s, uncovering vague memories, but no concrete identification yet. Despite decades passing, the key to solving the Bristol John Doe case isn't advanced forensics, it's awareness. Unlike most unidentified cases, where only partial information is available, here we have something incredibly rare. A photograph of what he actually looked like in life, taken when he was likely still fully connected to society. The photograph we have of him from the early 90s shows someone who was clean-cut and well-groomed and putting his best foot forward into the world. There are likely hundreds of people out there who would know who this John Doe is from this picture alone. They just haven't had the opportunity to see the photo. We also know what he looked like at the time of death, have detailed descriptions of his clothing, his belongings, and even his possible geographic history. This isn't a case lacking clues. It's one waiting for the right person to see his face and recognize him. His identity almost certainly lives in someone's memory, a former classmate, a friend from a shelter, or even a family member who lost touch. But without widespread exposure, that connection may never be made. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here as usual, just dropping in to give a huge shout out to all my YouTube members and my patrons who make this channel possible. Also, don't forget to follow Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts. I have lots of content there from this channel, my Solved True Crime channel, as well as some bonus content you won't see here. On April 6, 1979, 31-year-old Jean Pereira Sinapa, a former beauty queen and mother of three, was found brutally stabbed in a car on a highway near Kuala Lumpur. The gruesome discovery was made at a lonely underpass a few miles from the Subang airport, a dark stretch that provided the killer cover to strike unseen. The sensational case involving glamour, romance, and betrayal shocked the nation and remains unsolved to this day. She married a chemist, Sinapa Sivapakiam, and had 3 young children. Friends recalled Jean as vivacious and dedicated to her students. When her husband died in a car accident in late 1978, Jean moved in with her in-laws, including her husband's brother, 37-year-old Karthigesu Sivapakiam, a psychology lecturer. In the months that followed, Jean and Karthigesu grew close and even planned to marry. On the night of April 6, 1979, Jean and Karthigesu were driving home from an outing. Karthigesu later claimed he stopped along the roadside so he could take a leak, but I'll come back to that shortly. Around midnight, 2 passing Malaysia Airlines engineers came upon a shocking scene. A white Fiat parked by the isolated road, with a woman's motionless body inside. Jean, who was wearing a colorful sari that evening, was found still strapped in the front passenger seat, bleeding from roughly 10 stab wounds to her chest. Nearby, Karthigesu lay face down on the ground, unconscious, but still breathing. Police were called, and Carthagesu was rushed to a hospital while Jean was pronounced dead at the scene. When Carthagesu regained consciousness, he told officers that an unknown assailant had crept up and knocked him out, and that he awoke to find Jean brutally attacked. Investigators were immediately skeptical. Carthagesu had no visible injuries consistent with being hit hard enough to be rendered unconscious. Further, while he claimed he was going to the can near where he fell, there was no evidence to suggest anyone had recently urinated by the side of the road. With his account in doubt and no sign of any other perpetrator, suspicion began to fall squarely on Carthagesu himself. Over the next few weeks, police dug deeper, and on April 26, 1979, they arrested Carthagesu for Jean's slaying, and by May, he was formally charged. In a search of his house, investigators found a bag of love letters that Jean had exchanged with another man, a Sri Lankan doctor named Narada Warnasurya. These letters revealed Jean had been deeply romantically involved with the doctor, including talk of marriage between them. The correspondence suggested that Jean's involvement with Narada had even begun before her husband's death, adding a layer of scandal to the case. Ironically, one unsent letter from Jean to the doctor indicated she had decided to stay with Carthagesu, professing that her love for him was stronger. This complicated the love triangle narrative, but investigators believed Carthagesu must have learned of her infidelity regardless. Armed with jealousy as a motive, police theorized he turned a family relationship into a crime of passion. The case went to trial in mid-1980, drawing intense public interest in Malaysia. It was one of the most sensational court cases of its time, covered exhaustively by the media. Over 38 days of testimony, prosecutors painted Carthagesu as a jilted lover who had eliminated Jean out of bitterness and anger. They presented the trove of love letters as evidence of Jean's illicit affair and motive for the brutal attack. Notably, a friend of Carthagesu even came forward and gave testimony that Carthagesu had confided in him that Jean didn't deserve to live because of the affair. The defense in turn maintained that Carthagesu was innocent. He continued to insist that he never laid a hand on Jean, repeating his account of unknown attackers on the roadside. His lawyers emphasized that none of Jean's blood was found on Carthagesu's clothes despite the gory crime scene. They also noted that no weapon was ever found, and the timeline of events was tight. This left open the possibility that someone else could have committed the attack and fled before help arrived. One defense witness even testified to seeing a second car near the scene at the crucial time, hinting that another party might have been present. On August 1st, 1980, the 7-member jury delivered its verdict finding Carthagesu guilty. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging, though this wasn't without controversy. After all, the conviction rested entirely on circumstantial evidence and a confession about a conversation that allegedly occurred. In 1981, as Carthagesu awaited execution on death row, the key witness who claimed Carthagesu said Jean didn't deserve to live recanted his testimony. He claimed that he was pressured to frame Carthagesu by Jean's family since they were convinced that Carthagesu did it, but they weren't sure the evidence was sufficient. Jean's family, of course, completely denied this, stating that they wanted the real perpetrator to be behind bars no matter who the person was. On May 31st, 1981, Carthagesu's conviction was set aside and he was acquitted of all charges. After about 2 years behind bars, Carthagesu walked out of prison a free man, while his former friend ended up being given a 10-year prison sentence for perjury. In the years that followed, Carthagesu tried to move on, returning to his job and eventually getting married and starting a family. Meanwhile, the slaying of John Pereira Sinapa continues to remain Malaysia's most infamous unsolved mystery. It's a warm summer evening on a lonely highway. A car cruises along, headlights cutting through the dusk. Years ago, the driver's windshield would have been spattered with the remains of dozens of insects by the end of the trip. Today, however, that glass stays eerily clean. The near absence of smashed bugs on the windshield is perplexing, even unsettling. There's a mystery unfolding on our roads, a silent disappearance that's been dubbed the windshield phenomenon. The windshield phenomenon is the observation that far fewer bugs end up squashed on car windshields today than in decades past. Many drivers have noticed that after a long drive, they no longer need to scrub their windshield clean of dead insects the way they once did. Essentially, this case of the missing splats suggests something has changed in the environment, and not in a small way. Older drivers even recall summer nights when so many moths swarmed their headlights it looked like a blizzard. This spectacle, nicknamed the moth snowstorm, has now largely vanished from memory. For years, the windshield phenomenon remained a curious anecdote. Some experts urged caution, noting that windshields might not be a scientific gauge of insect populations. Yet the reports of empty windshields kept coming. Entomologists themselves admitted they were cleaning their cars far less often than before. By 2017, the anecdote had turned into alarm. Major media outlets worldwide ran stories about drastic insect declines over the past few decades. The windshield phenomenon was no longer just small talk. It was evidence in an unfolding environmental mystery. This was a turning point. What had started as casual chatter was now front-page news and a cause for very serious concern. In Germany, one scientist went so far as to warn that we were on course for an ecological Armageddon as insect ecosystems quietly collapsed. People everywhere began to ask with growing urgency, where have all the insects gone? Anecdotes alone don't prove a case, but now hard data confirms the windshield phenomenon is indeed real. In Denmark, a 20-year survey counting bugs splattered on car windshields found an 80% decline in insect hits between 1997 and 2017. In the United Kingdom, concern about disappearing insects led to a massive citizen science experiment. In 2004, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds recruited 40,000 motorists to count how many bugs hit a small grid on their car's license plate during their drives. The result was about one squashed insect every 8 kilometers of driving. When wildlife groups repeated this experiment in 2019, they found about 50% fewer bug splats than in 2004, and by 2021, a survey in one region showed roughly a 70% drop. These consistent results across different countries all tell the same story. Insect life has plummeted, and it's not just our imagination. To rule out alternative explanations, scientists even checked whether modern aerodynamic cars simply kill fewer insects than older, boxier models. The answer was no. Modern cars actually hit slightly more insects in tests, so car design isn't the reason for the disappearing splats. The decline is genuine, and the scale of it is alarming. Losing 50 to 80% of insects in just a few decades is like an ecological nightmare unfolding in the blink of an eye. In fact, the windshield findings align with a wave of other research showing steep insect losses in many regions. For example, a long-term study in German nature reserves documented about a 75% loss in flying insect biomass over 26 years. Some experts are calling this trend an insect apocalypse, an existential threat to ecosystems across the globe. Research into insect declines points to a combination of interlocking factors. Human expansion and intensive agriculture have drastically reduced or altered the habitats where insects once thrived. Wild meadows, forests, and wetlands have been cleared or broken into isolated patches, leaving many insects with nowhere to live or breed. Since World War II, industrial farming has poured a vast tide of insect-killing chemicals onto the land. These pesticides and other pollutants don't discriminate. They often kill beneficial insects along with pests, contributing hugely to the overall decline of insect populations. Shifting climate patterns are disrupting insect life cycles. Warmer temperatures and altered rainfall can throw off the timing of flowering and breeding, and extreme weather events can wipe out local insect colonies. The spread of artificial light at night is another factor harming insects. Many insects are drawn to or disoriented by bright lights, which interferes with their feeding and reproduction. Notably, light pollution has been cited as a key factor in the quote-unquote insect apocalypse by entomologists studying nocturnal insect losses. Each of these forces likely plays a part, and together they create a perfect storm for insect life. Researchers have noted it's probably a mix of a variety of factors driving the decline. Regardless, though, the end result is exactly what we see on our windshields: far fewer bugs in the air than there used to be. It might be a relief to have a cleaner windshield, but the disappearance of bugs should worry us. Insects aren't just pests to be swatted. They're pillars of ecosystems and providers of services that humans depend on. For example, roughly 3/4 of our crop types rely on insects, like bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, to reproduce. If those pollinators vanish, many fruits, vegetables, and nuts would become scarce, threatening our food supply and economies. Insects also happen to be the most numerous animals on the planet by far. They make up as much as 90% of all animal species on Earth. In other words, they're the foundation of the animal kingdom's diversity. Not surprisingly then, insects are the base of countless food webs. Those squashed bugs on the windshield would have been meals for birds, bats, frogs, and other creatures. Areas suffering big insect losses are already seeing declines in insect-eating birds and other wildlife. If the all-you-can-eat buffet disappears, larger animals that rely on it will struggle to survive, and whole ecosystems could unravel around them. Scientists warn that continuing insect declines could even trigger a collapse of nature's ecosystems on a catastrophic scale. In short, losing insects would send shockwaves through both the environment and human society alike. On June 12, 1985, 41-year-old Dottie Kaler did something that terrified her. She ventured alone into a busy Bay Area rapid transit station in Pleasant Hill, California, to buy a train ticket. For most people, this was a mundane errand, but for Dottie, it was a remarkable act. She suffered from severe agoraphobia, an intense fear of public places that often kept her housebound. But here's the thing. No one can confirm if she ever boarded the train, and her husband's story is suspect. And from that day forward, no trace of Dottie Kaler has ever been found. Dottie Kaler was a Concord, California housewife known to family and friends as a quiet, thoughtful woman living an extremely reclusive life. Born Dorothy Mae Rusnak in 1944, she was originally from Ohio and had worked as a legal secretary before marrying Jewel Kaler in the mid-1970s. Also, I may be showing my age here, but I had no idea Dottie was once a common nickname for people named Dorothy, but I digress. The couple settled in Concord, where Dottie's personality was shaped in part by her mental health struggles. Her life was largely governed by her extreme agoraphobia, a debilitating anxiety disorder that made her fearful of venturing into public spaces. This condition turned her home into a self-imposed sanctuary. Dottie rarely went out, couldn't hold a job due to panic attacks, and carefully planned even minor outings. By 1985, at age 41, she spent most of her time inside, and had become increasingly dependent on her husband, Jewel, for contact with the outside world. Life with Jewel Kaler was far from idyllic for Dottie. The marriage had serious problems simmering under the surface. Jewel, an entomologist and aerial photographer, often traveled for work and was away from home more than half the time. Left alone with her anxieties, Dottie grew suspicious of Jewel's long absences. Her worries weren't unfounded, and friends later revealed that Jewel also had an unpaid side hustle laying pipe for lonely ladies. In fact, Jewel had secretly proposed to a female coworker about 6 months before Dottie disappeared, even purchasing wedding rings while still married to Dottie. Unsurprisingly, this double life deeply strained their relationship, and the couple's arguments sometimes escalated into ugly fights. On Thanksgiving 1981, a particularly violent incident occurred that would later take on a chilling significance. During a confrontation, Jewel struck Dottie in the head with a piece of furniture, injuring her enough that she needed stitches. Jewel claimed he acted in self-defense, alleging that Dottie had threatened him with a pair of scissors, and no charges were filed in the end. By the mid-1980s, Dottie and Jewel's marriage was hanging by a thread, defined by distrust, fear, and increasing bouts of violence. Despite her crippling fears, Dottie was slowly gathering the courage to change her situation. In 1984, she quietly joined a support group for women in troubled marriages. Notably, this group was named Women in Transition, which I feel would perhaps not be the ideal name for this group if it were founded in, let's say 2025. Without telling Jewel, Dottie made new friends through the group and started taking small steps toward independence. Her friends noticed positive changes. Dottie updated her hairstyle, added color to her wardrobe, and seemed more confident, as if a new Dottie were emerging. Crucially, she also took concrete steps to prepare for a possible split from her husband. Dottie opened a secret bank account in her own name and had a post office box for private mail. She squirreled away money from selling some belongings, eventually converting about $5,000 into a cashier's check that she kept hidden with a close friend for safekeeping. This money was meant as an emergency fund in case she needed to escape quickly. Dottie even stashed documents and evidence of Jewel's infidelities and threats in a locked file cabinet at a friend's house, telling the friend to give it to police if anything ever happened to her. By the spring of 1985, Dottie had told her sister and friends that she intended to divorce Jewel and start anew. In May 1985, Jewel announced he had received a job transfer to Salt Lake City and would be moving there. Dottie flatly refused to go with him, and according to family members, she and Jewel agreed to separate. Dottie would stay in the Concord house and buy out Jewel's share, while Jewel would relocate to Utah for his new job. In the weeks before Jewel's planned departure, Dottie packed up many of his belongings and put them in storage. She appeared determined to build an independent life free from her husband's control. Friends later said Dottie was looking forward to a fresh start, which makes what happened next all the more tragic and baffling. On the morning of June 12, 1985, Dottie Kaler told Jewel she planned to visit a friend for a short overnight trip before he left for Utah. Jewel claims that around midday, he drove Dottie to the Pleasant Hill BART station so she could take a train on her journey. He said Dottie brought an overnight bag and her turquoise purse, which contained essentials like her ID, some cash, and a special allergy kit she always carried. According to Jewel, he dropped her off outside the station and watched as Dottie walked around the corner into the terminal. That was the last time anyone has reported seeing her. There were no witnesses who recalled Dottie at the station beyond Jewel's account. No one saw her board a train, and she did not reach out to any friends or family afterward. The next day, June 13th, Jewel returned to the BART parking lot after work and was surprised to find Dottie's 1963 Volkswagen Beetle parked in the lot right next to his own car. This was immediately perplexing. If Jewel had driven Dottie to the station, why was her car there? Peering inside, Jewel found Dottie's purse sitting on the seat, containing her wallet, identification, credit cards, and about $30 in cash. The only item missing from the purse was Dottie's allergy kit. Everything else she normally kept with her was left behind. Dottie was known to never go anywhere without her purse. Leaving it in her car was completely out of character. Jewel later told police he left a note on the windshield asking Dottie to contact him, then moved her car to a different spot, supposedly to avoid a parking ticket. He even hid her purse under the seat, supposedly for safekeeping. Over the next 4 days, Jewel claims, he returned to check the car and left additional notes begging Dottie to come home. Yet he didn't report his wife officially missing until June 17th, 5 days after she vanished, and only did so at the urging of a neighbor. 2 weeks after Dottie's disappearance, Jewel Kaler packed up and moved permanently to Utah to start his new job, effectively leaving the state while the search for his wife had barely begun. Dottie Kaler's case was initially treated as a missing persons investigation, with the strong possibility that she left voluntarily, especially given her unhappy marriage. In the early weeks, some of Dottie's friends and relatives wondered if she might have used her newfound confidence to run away and start a new life free from Jewel. Dottie had, after all, been making plans to leave, and had even hinted she might disappear. Jewel certainly embraced this idea. He speculated to police that Dottie simply took off to quote-unquote disrupt his life. He suggested she might be hiding out, or even that someone helped her disappear permanently. However, as time went on, evidence strongly contradicted the theory that Dottie vanished by choice. Nearly everything investigators learned pointed to foul play rather than a planned escape. Several red flags in the case made authorities and Dottie's family deeply suspicious. Dottie's car turning up at the station next to Jewel's, despite him having supposedly dropped her off, is difficult to explain. It seems to suggest that perhaps she independently drove the vehicle there, perhaps to meet up with someone whose car just happened to be right there as well. Despite carefully saving funds for a potential escape, Dottie never withdrew a dime from her secret bank account after June 12th. The $5,000 cashier's check she had hidden for emergencies was never cashed, and there has been no activity on any of her financial accounts since she disappeared. If she had started a new life somewhere, she inexplicably did so without touching the money she set aside for that very purpose. Now, it's always possible that this money was intentionally left there to throw off investigators, but Dottie wasn't wealthy by any means. To put this in perspective, this is about $15,000 in 2025 dollars, which could go a very long way in starting a new life, especially when she had been out of the workforce for a while. Curiously, Jewel waiting 5 days to report Dottie missing looked highly suspicious to police and family. Moreover, him moving out of state just 2 weeks later, essentially fleeing the area, struck many as not the behavior of a worried husband. This quick exit to Utah, with Dottie's fate unresolved, raised serious eyebrows among investigators. However, some have pointed out that they were essentially already separated, even though they were living together, which may explain his lack of concern. Under this theory, Jewel was simply a cold-hearted guy who wanted to move on as soon as possible. During police questioning, Jewel's story contained inconsistencies and concerning revelations. Records showed he had taken several sick days off from work around the time of Dottie's disappearance, including leaving work early on June 12th and taking off the day before. Curiously, he failed to mention these facts to police upon initial questioning. Jewel also refused to take polygraph tests, and I know I'm going to get comments about how polygraphs are junk science. So to head off those comments, I'll just say that a polygraph is an investigative tool, and his refusal to take one, perhaps, wasn't a good sign. Given these clues, Dottie's family came to believe that she did not leave voluntarily at all, but rather met with foul play. Before long, Jewel Kaler became the prime person of interest in the eyes of those who followed the case. Interestingly, a letter he wrote to the woman he was engaged to indicated that he would do literally anything for her. He even explicitly said that he would kill to be with her, which, if he meant it metaphorically, may have been an inappropriate choice of words given the circumstances. Over the years, investigators have searched for tangible proof of what happened to Dottie, but without a body or direct witness, the case remains circumstantial. In 1988, police received an anonymous letter postmarked from Indiana that accused Jewel Kaler of slaying his wife. The letter claimed Jewel beat Dottie with a tire iron and buried her under a tree at a construction site, even providing a hand-drawn map of the supposed burial location. A significant investigation was conducted due to this letter, but nothing turned up, and it was unclear if this was a hoax. Interestingly, some have alleged that the letter was actually written by Jewel himself in an effort to throw investigators off. In 2001, the Concord Police Department officially reopened Dottie's cold case, classifying it as a likely slaying. They served search warrants on the Kalers' former home in 2005, even excavating the backyard with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. This dramatic effort also came up empty, and no hidden grave or any evidence was discovered to conclusively solve the mystery. Through it all, Jewel Kaler has maintained his innocence and insisted that Dottie chose to leave him. In a 2001 newspaper interview, Jewel shockingly remarked that he had more or less forgotten about his wife's disappearance, assuming she was dead and no longer his concern. He described life with Dottie as practically unbearable, and admitted that once she was gone and he started his new life in Utah, things were pretty good for him. To Dottie's loved ones, these words sounded like those of a man who felt relief that she was gone. Jewel Kaler is still alive and has never been charged with any crime in relation to the disappearance of Dottie. At present, it remains unclear if Dottie's disappearance will remain an unsolved mystery, or if there will finally be closure on her case nearly a half-century later. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to click like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon, and follow Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts. On a cold January night in 1984, 24-year-old Sherry Hart left her home in Ashe County, North Carolina, expecting a simple evening out. She had recently moved back in with her parents after a divorce, and was the devoted mother of a 6-year-old daughter. But Sherry never returned home that night, and what began as a missing person case soon unfolded into one of North Carolina's most haunting unsolved mysteries. 11 months later, hikers discovered Sherry's skeletal remains at the base of a steep cliff known as Jumping Off Rock. This is a scenic overlook in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a perilous 1,200-foot drop. The investigation that followed revealed a story of betrayal and violence, and a prime suspect who escaped justice, leaving Sherry's family waiting decades for answers. On the evening of January 15, 1984, Sherry told her family she was going out to meet someone, reportedly a date at a local restaurant. When that date never showed up, Sherry crossed paths with 2 local young men, Richard Lynn Bear and Jeffrey Scott Burgess. According to statements later given by Burgess, they later talked her into hanging out and cruising around town with them. And trust me when I say it, You're going to want to take everything that Burgess said about this case with the biggest rock of salt you can possibly locate. Bear and Burgess were a few years younger and not close friends of Sherry's, but in a small town, it wasn't unusual for people to run into each other and socialize in groups. Tragically, this fateful decision to ride around with Bear and Burgess would be the last time anyone saw Sherry Hart alive. When Sherry failed to return home, her family grew alarmed and reported her missing the next day. An initial search turned up a disturbing clue. Sherry's car was found abandoned in the town of West Jefferson, which immediately raised suspicions of foul play. In those first weeks, however, leads were scarce. With no sign of Sherry and no evidence of a struggle at the time, local gossip even fueled a theory that Sherry had run off to Florida with a lover, hoping to start a new life. Sherry's 6-year-old daughter was left confused and heartbroken, even wondering if her mother had willingly left her behind. This was a notion that would be dispelled when the truth came to light. As winter turned to spring and then summer without any answers, Sherry's family endured an agonizing wait, clinging to hope that she might still be found safe. Nearly a year passed with no breakthroughs. Then, on December 10th, 1984, a group of hikers made a gruesome discovery in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains known as Jumping Off Rock. At the bottom of a rugged cliff, they stumbled upon human remains. Authorities were called, and the remains were soon identified as Sherry Hart. It was now painfully clear that Sherry had never run off to Florida or anywhere else. She had been the victim of a horrific crime close to home. Investigators determined that Sherry had suffered severe trauma before her body was thrown from the overlook, indicating she had been slain and dumped off the cliff. One tip in early 1985 proved crucial. A witness reported seeing Sherry on the night of January 15, 1984, in the company of Richard Bear and Jeff Burgess. Investigators learned that Bear's own brother had once dated Sherry, so she wasn't a complete stranger to them. This connection made the witness account even more significant. Acting on this lead, Ashe County Sheriff's deputies brought Burgess in for questioning in late March 1985. Confronted with evidence and perhaps his own guilt, Jeffrey Burgess eventually cracked and gave a chilling confession outlining what he says happened to Sherry Hart. According to Burgess's statements, the evening started out innocently. Sherry agreed to go joyriding with him and Bear after her original plans fell through. At some point during their drive through the back roads, Sherry asked the two men to pull over so she could take a quick rest stop by the roadside. They stopped the car about a quarter mile from the scenic cliff known as the Jumping Off Place, and what happened next turned deadly. Burgess told investigators that when Sherry walked into the woods for a moment, Richard Bear followed her and made unwanted illicit advances toward her. Sherry resisted these advances and ran back toward the car, reportedly even pleading with Burgess to help protect her from Bear's aggression. Before Burgess could intervene, Bear burst out of the woods enraged. He was armed with a handgun, and he struck Sherry in the back of the head with the pistol, knocking her down. Sherry was gravely wounded and began bleeding. Panicked, Bear and Burgess placed her back in the car and decided to drive to the nearby cliff. When they reached Jumping Off Rock, Bear dragged the injured Sherry out of the vehicle, forced her to the edge at gunpoint, and pushed her off the cliff. Burgess claimed that he went along with this out of fear. He said Bear threatened to eliminate him and his family if he ever told anyone what happened. Armed with Burgess's confession and supporting evidence, authorities moved quickly. On March 29, 1985, Richard Bear and Jeff Burgess were both arrested and charged. The community, shocked and outraged, now had faces to attach to this horrendous crime. Just 4 months after his arrest, Richard Bear pulled off a brazen escape from custody dashing any immediate hope of closure in Sherry's case. On July 17, 1985, while awaiting trial in the Wilkes County Jail, Bear simply walked out of the jail when a guard's attention was elsewhere. The ease of his jailbreak was shocking. A suspect effectively slipped through the fingers of law enforcement in broad daylight. A massive manhunt ensued, but Bear had a head start and a determination not to be caught. Despite extensive efforts, he managed to vanish without a trace and has remained a fugitive for almost 4 decades. And trust me, if you're thinking this whole thing is fishy, you're not the only one. But I'll get back to that in a moment. The impact of Bear's escape on the case was devastating. With the prime suspect gone, Jeffrey Burgess's trial was put on hold. Authorities decided not to prosecute Burgess for the slaying as long as the ringleader was at large, especially since Burgess had been the key witness against Bear. In fact, Burgess was released on bail pending Bear's recapture, essentially as a reward for his cooperation. This meant that no one was held accountable in court for Sherry's death, a bitter pill for the Hart family and the community to swallow. Years passed, and the trial never took place, and Burgess continued to live under suspicion, but maintained that he never intended harm to Sherry. Despite confessing to his involvement, he ended up living out his life as a free man until he died in 2012. Naturally, many have questioned whether Burgess was telling the truth about his role in the crime. After all, he had a strong incentive to portray himself as an unwilling accomplice in a crime committed by a madman. Richard Bear, meanwhile, became the target of an intensive, long-running fugitive investigation. Sightings of Bear were reported over the years, but each time he slipped away. In one instance in 1993, the FBI got a tip that Bear was hiding at a relative's home in Delaware. Agents arrived just hours too late, finding that Bear had already fled the location. Tips continued to come in sporadically, and some claim Bear was still in North Carolina, possibly sheltered by friends or family. There's been rampant speculation and theories about Richard Bear in the years following his escape. One popular notion is that Bear had help, either during his 1985 escape or in hiding afterwards. His escape was so simple that it fueled speculation about whether someone intentionally left a door unlocked or looked the other way. Notably, the person responsible for watching him was fired and appears to have been charged in relation to the escape. Perhaps he should have fallen asleep, along with a colleague, and then made a surveillance camera malfunction, while later falsifying log entries of what happened during that time. Rumor has it under those sort of circumstances, you'll just get a slap on the wrist no matter what sort of prisoner you're guarding. Even if they're accused of having ties to extremely powerful and well-connected people, you'll literally just get the most minor punishment available. After the escape, rumors suggest that Bear stayed hidden by relying on a network of friends or family willing to shelter him and keep his secrets. Some tips over the years claimed Bear was right back in Ashe County, living out in the open, suggesting some significant local corruption. In fact, there have been unconfirmed witness reports that Bear periodically snuck back into town in disguise to attend the funerals of his relatives. Authorities took these reports seriously enough to stake out at least one family funeral, but they were never able to conclusively nab him. The authorities remain uncertain if Bear is alive at this time, though given how young he was at the time of the crime he allegedly committed, he wouldn't even be a senior citizen yet. Also, as I was recording this, I realized I said allegedly here, as if Richard Bear is going to come out and sue me over saying he did it. I'm not sure why, but the idea of him doing that and then getting arrested at the deposition is somewhat amusing to me. April is now an adult with a family of her own, and continues to pursue justice for her mother all these years later. Personally, I suspect that Richard Bear has to be protected by a fairly large network of people locally who don't accept that he was involved in the case. That said, that's just complete speculation on my part, but I don't see how else a 20-year-old is able to go on the run for 4 decades. Unfortunately, even if Richard Bear is caught today, the primary witness against him is long deceased, which may make securing a conviction much more difficult. It's a late-night drive in the mid-1990s, and depending on who you are, you're probably listening to Green Day or TLC, or maybe Biggie on your car's tape deck. You're on a quiet suburban road when you notice an oncoming car with its headlights off. In that era of gang panic, many people heard a terrifying warning: don't flash your lights at that car. According to the rumor, this was part of a gang initiation game. A prospective member drives with his lights out, and the first Good Samaritan to blink their high beams is marked for elimination. This gruesome tale spread fear across the United States, tapping into the anxieties of a decade preoccupied with gang violence and random crime. The headlight gang initiation legend didn't arise overnight. It evolved over years before hitting the mainstream. Folklorists traced its roots to the early 1980s, when an outlaw biker gang like the Hells Angels was rumored to be initiating recruits with this deadly lights-out ploy. By the mid-1980s, the story had shifted to urban street gangs. It was now the Latin Kings or the Bloods or the Crips targeting these Good Samaritans. The tale spread by word of mouth for years until new technology gave it a boost. In 1993, a bogus police bulletin spread via fax warned of a violent gang initiation weekend involving headlight traps. Some law enforcement agencies, deceived by the official-looking memo, even issued public alerts of their own before realizing the hoax. However, by that time it was too late, and the myth snowballed, and what began as local hearsay had exploded into a nationwide urban legend. By the late 1990s, the headlight initiation scare was making headlines and creeping into nightly newscasts. Panicked citizens were calling police and news outlets for answers. Trashy daytime tabloid talk shows like Ricky Lake and Jenny Jones talked about the topic as if it were real, spreading even greater fear, as was the style at the time. Amid this frenzy, a real-life tragedy seemed to confirm the worst fears. In the early 90s, 29-year-old Kelly Freed was shot after the car she was in flashed its headlights at another vehicle that had its lights off. The teenage shooters weren't acting out any gang right, and they later said they irrationally took the headlight flash as a personal insult. That said, this very real incident eerily mirrored the legend's premise, blurring the line between rumor and reality. To an anxious public, this case made the lights-out warning feel frighteningly plausible. It's necessary to examine why this urban legend took root, despite having little basis in reality beyond some unconnected incidents. The answer lies in the social climate and psychology of the 1990s. High-profile gang crime coverage fueled a perception that danger lurked everywhere. Many people felt a random gang attack could happen to anyone, even in suburbia. In fact, according to local news broadcasts in the 90s, perhaps the most dangerous place to be when it came to gang violence was your seemingly safe suburban home. The headlight flashing legend tapped directly into that fear. It was the idea that even a small act of courtesy could get you cut down by violent gang members invading your suburban haven. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, authorities struggled to extinguish the lights-out myth with facts. Despite having played a large role in the perpetuation of the myth, law enforcement was the first to try to shut it down as well. Police departments nationwide affirmed they couldn't find a single documented instance of gangs blasting drivers for flashing their headlights. Perhaps the greatest reassurances came from cops who specialized in anti-gang activity. These gang experts stress that real initiation rites rarely involve random targets, simply because this would bring extreme heat to any criminal organization. Recruits are typically jumped in by surviving a beating or tasked with crimes that further the organization. What they are not told to do is to invite a potential statewide or even nationwide manhunt by shooting an innocent motorist for no reason whatsoever. Interestingly, in later years, many current and former gang members also came out to say the entire thing was bogus. Again, they emphasized that these activities would draw significant heat from law enforcement, which could get the whole organization arrested. Further, they also emphasized that street gangs are often ultimately controlled by much more dangerous and powerful prison gangs and organized crime groups. These groups thrive partly because of their ability to maintain some degree of order amongst street-level operatives. Despite all the debunking, the headlight initiation myth has never fully died out. Each new communications medium has given it fresh life, from photocopied flyers and faxes to email chain letters and now social media posts. As recently as this decade, authorities and fact-checkers have had to refute viral posts, reviving the old warning for a new generation. Late one night, a teenager is babysitting in a sprawling upscale home. The children are fast asleep upstairs, and the house is still, and to pass the time, the babysitter sits down to watch TV. But in the corner of the room stands a life-sized clown statue, silent and eerie. Its painted eyes seem to follow her, and at first she tries to ignore the unsettling decoration, but her unease grows with every glance. Eventually, the babysitter can't shake the feeling that something is very wrong. Overwhelmed by the statue's creepy presence, she decides to call the parents and ask permission to watch TV in their bedroom. What happens next is the classic twist that has made the clown statue an infamous urban legend. On the other end of the line, the father falls silent. Then, in a panicked tone, he tells the babysitter, "We don't have a clown statue." The babysitter's blood runs cold as the father says, "Get the kids and get out of the house." Heart pounding, the babysitter drops the phone and races to gather the children. Clutching the sleepy youngsters, she flees the house and calls the police from a neighbor's home. Moments later, she witnesses a terrifying sight: a pale, painted face peeking from the upstairs window, then vanishing back into the darkness. When police arrive and sweep the house, the horrifying truth is revealed. They arrest a man in a clown costume hiding on the property. In some tellings, he is a wanted serial predator, or perhaps an escaped mental patient armed with a knife. In others, he's a disturbed homeless person who somehow slipped inside and survived by sneaking food, only to pose as a lifeless doll whenever someone was nearby. In the darkest versions of the tale, the story ends in bloodshed. The clown slays the babysitter before fleeing into the night. But in most recountings, thanks to the babysitter's phone call, her and the children are saved from a fate that could have been unimaginably grim. This vivid scenario has all the ingredients of a modern campfire story. An ordinary home turned into a house of horrors, a creepy clown figure corrupted into a real predator, and a twist ending that leaves listeners with goosebumps. It's no wonder that many who hear the babysitter and the clown statue story find it hauntingly memorable. Some even believe for a time that it might be true, but it's not a documented real incident. In reality, the creepy clown statue is just an urban myth, one so pervasive that it's often presented as a true story. The clown statue legend is a relatively recent addition to the pantheon of urban lore. Folklorists and fact-checkers note that it first began circulating in the early 2000s, though I'll get to its potentially older roots in a moment. Unlike classic legends passed on by word of mouth over generations, This story found life in the age of the internet. In fact, it appears to have started as a chain email or online message around 2004, which urged readers to forward the tale to others. The chain email would almost always include a variant of a phrase saying that you would be responsible for the next attack if you didn't forward it on. This kind of curse was a common hallmark of chain letters and early internet ghost stories, designed to give the legend a sense of urgency and interactive fear. Unsurprisingly, this tactic worked. The story spread rapidly through email inboxes and forum posts, picking up new embellishments along the way. That said, some believe that the story is rooted in an older urban legend and is actually a modern retelling of it, with a coat of white face paint and a red nose attached. These folklorists observe that it's essentially a modern offshoot of the babysitter and the man upstairs legend. This is the classic tale dating back to at least the 1960s, in which a babysitter is terrorized by an unknown caller who, famously, turns out to be calling from inside the house. Both stories follow a very similar blueprint. A young person alone with children, a false sense of security shattered by a revelation that the threat's close by, and the theme of an ordinary night turning into a nightmare. The clown statue legend swaps out the telephone stalker for a clown in disguise, but the core fear, an intruder hiding where you least expect, remains the same. In the 21st century retelling, the intruder isn't merely on another phone line in the house. He's right there in the room, perhaps taking inspiration from modern horror films and our visual culture of fear. Urban legends persist not just because they're told often, but because they tap into primal human fears. Coulrophobia, the fear of clowns, is one of the most common phobias out there, and even those who wouldn't call it a phobia often find clowns a bit unsettling. Moreover, the clown statue legend plays on the fear of hidden intruders and violated sanctuaries. Our homes are supposed to be safe spaces, and the thought that someone could be hiding within our house, watching us, biding their time, is the stuff of nightmares. There are, of course, real cases like this, where an intruder lives in a house, which are amongst the most disturbing cases imaginable. This legend brilliantly combines two fears, the uncanny fear many people have of clowns, and the very real fear of a home invasion. Further, it reminds us of the first times we were home alone, as the babysitter is young and naturally a bit scared by being alone. On a moonlit night in Lafayette, Colorado, you might hear whispers of a vampire lurking in the local cemetery. For decades, locals and curious visitors have been drawn to a particular grave, a grave marked by a weathered headstone and a gnarled tree said to have sprouted from the heart of a vampire. According to legend, a Transylvania-born miner buried here didn't rest in peace. He allegedly rose from the grave with glowing red eyes, prowling among the tombstones at night. The man behind the legend was Todor Glava, a Romanian immigrant from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. According to contemporary accounts, he was working as a coal miner and attempting to save up to bring his wife over to America when he died in 1918. Glava was laid to rest in Lafayette's municipal cemetery, and his modest gravestone was crudely carved with his name, the year 1918, and his birthplace, Transylvania. He was even buried beside another Romanian miner, John Trandafir, who died in the same year, and the two men's names share a single headstone. At the time, Transylvania was already famous as the setting of Bram Stoker's Dracula, so that eerie inscription didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't until decades later that whispers of a vampire in Lafayette began to stir. By the 1950s, local parents were reportedly invoking the Lafayette vampire as a boogeyman to keep their children from staying out too late. If you didn't get home by dark, the vampire in the cemetery would get you. Fueled by this fascination, local teenagers and storytellers in the 50s and 60s likely embellished Glava's story even further. After all, a pale, lanky outsider from Transylvania made the perfect candidate for a ghost story in a small Colorado town. Over the years, the legend of the Lafayette vampire grew more elaborate with each telling. The most common version goes like this. Glava was an unnaturally tall, pale man who aroused suspicion among his neighbors. When he died in 1918, some locals weren't convinced he would stay gone. In whispers, they claimed a group of fearful townsfolk dug up his coffin to check the body. Supposedly, they found blood on his lips, unusually sharp teeth, and nails still growing, obvious signs that Lafayette had a vampire on its hands. Panicking, the townsfolk drove a wooden stake through Glava's heart to ensure he never rose again, then hastily reburied him. According to legend, that wooden stake took root and grew into a hardy juniper tree right out of Glava's grave. Indeed, even today a gnarled tree stands directly atop the burial site, unlike any other tree placement in that part of the cemetery. The tale also insists that Glava's fingernails continued to grow underground, emerging as thorny rose brambles that once covered the grave. For decades, a wild rose bush entwined the grave site, and its flowers were described in ghost stories as blood-red blooms nourished by the vampire's blood. Other contemporary reports say that the roses were yellow, which doesn't hit quite the same way when it comes to building up a vampire legend. In later years, imaginative new details were added to the tale. One account spun a yarn about Glava being cursed by a wolf's bite, slaying his wife, and ultimately getting cornered in a barn and staked by a neighbor. This is despite the fact that all contemporary evidence indicates that his wife was still residing in Austria-Hungary when he perished. Also, this puts aside the obvious absurdity of someone being transformed into a vampire by a wolf bite. It's like someone got some of the lore mixed up. Despite all the spooky lore, historical evidence paints a much more mundane picture. Todor Glava wasn't an undead fiend at all, but a victim of the Spanish flu. He fell ill and died, and his body was embalmed and buried within 2 days of death. Despite the apparently unusual nature of the man, the locals at the time didn't seriously believe he was a vampire, and no hysteria took hold. Today, the Lafayette vampire is considered one of Colorado's most obscure urban legends. For Glava himself, a man who died far away from his loved ones and homeland, the legend has granted a kind of immortality, ensuring his grave is never forgotten. In the end, the Lafayette vampire legend is a curious blend of fact and fiction, the tale of a mortal man transformed into a myth, simply because he was from a place deemed to be creepy. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, by searching wherever you get your podcasts. Also, quick reminder that there's a merch store where you can get some sweet loot. You're browsing the internet, minding your own business, maybe researching local pizza joints, or watching a video about the top 4 spookiest vacuum cleaners in Vermont. Suddenly, like a mirage in the desert, an advertisement appears. Hot singles in your area are waiting to meet you. If you know this feeling, you've been struck by the siren song of the digital age. Who are they? Do they really live in your area? And why are they always waiting around for you in particular? Of course, no one has ever confirmed meeting one of these mythical singles. Like Bigfoot or the perfectly ripe avocado at the grocery store, they exist more in theory than in practice. Still, The legend endures. It's become a meme, a joke, a warning, passed down like an oral tradition, whispered from one generation of internet users to the next. Beware the hot singles, for they want your mother's maiden name and date of birth before chatting, we tell each other, like old sea captains warning of sirens on the rocks. In the end, we know they're not real. But deep down, maybe we prefer to believe we live in a world where even in a desolate Alaska cabin, we're surrounded by hot singles in a 3-mile radius. Deep in the forests of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, whispers tell of a creature with the head of a dog and the torso or body of a man. Allegedly 7 feet tall with piercing blue or glowing amber eyes, this beast unleashes a chilling howl that sounds almost human, despite being clearly animal-like. It has reportedly been seen mostly in the state's northwestern counties. Locals call it the Michigan Dogman, an urban legend that has captivated and unnerved people for generations. The tale of the Dogman is both engaging and mysterious, rooted in frontier-era folklore yet revived in modern times. The earliest recorded Dogman sighting dates back to 1887 in Wexford County, Michigan, where 2 lumberjacks reported a creature with a man's body and a dog's head. According to lore, the Dogman appears in a cycle every 10 years, always in years ending in 7, though this pattern is unconfirmed. Throughout the early 20th century, sporadic reports continued. In 1937, a man in Paris, Michigan, claimed he was attacked by several dogs, and that one stood up on 2 legs and glared at him, staring directly into his soul. Similar encounters were reported in Allegan County in the 1950s and near Cross Village in 1967. Many of these early accounts came from remote logging camps and rural farmsteads, settings where isolation helped the legend take root. For most of the 20th century, the Dogman remained a relatively obscure piece of local lore until a single radio broadcast brought it back into the spotlight. In 1987, disc jockey Steve Cook, who worked at a country music station in Traverse City, decided to produce an April Fool's Day prank that would become the stuff of legend. Cook wrote and recorded a ballad called The Legend, spinning a spooky poem about a creature lurking in Michigan, based on a mix of local myths and his own imagination. Cook intended it as a fun Halloween-style tall tale, but when he played it on air, the response was anything but a joke. The station was flooded with calls from listeners who swore the beast in the song wasn't fictional. Many claimed they themselves, or someone they knew, had encountered a towering wolf-like creature in real life. The legend became an instant hit, and within weeks it was the most requested song on the station. Cook was astonished to receive dozens of letters and tapes recounting supposed Dogman sightings, some dating back decades. Capitalizing on the interest, he sold cassette copies of the song and even added new verses in later versions as fresh reports rolled in. And according to the accounts, he donated the proceeds from the unexpected hit to local Michigan charities. So yeah, let's have a quick round of applause for Steve Cook, both for reviving the Dogman legend and being so generous with the windfall. Over the years, Dogman encounters have shared striking similarities. Witnesses often describe driving down an isolated road or camping deep in the woods when a tall, shaggy figure suddenly emerges from the darkness. The creature might leap in front of a vehicle or scratch on a cabin door before vanishing into the night. Each story, whether from a 1960s farmhouse or a 21st century highway, adds another thread to the Dogman's legend, keeping locals cautious and the legend alive. Cryptozoologists believe the Dogman might be a genuine unknown species, essentially a real-life wolf that has some features in common with mythical werewolves. They point to the consistency of eyewitness descriptions and draw parallels to similar Wolfman legends like Wisconsin's Beast of Bray Road. Believers also note that Michigan's wilderness still holds surprises. For instance, cougars were long thought absent in the state until recent years, when sightings confirmed they had returned. While official estimates indicate that there's only about 100 cougars in Michigan at present, anyone who's been out to a bar in Michigan knows that number has to be way off. Others believe that the Michigan Dogman could be a spiritual entity associated with Native American legend. The Ojibwe speak of malevolent spirits, which can take the form of monstrous animal-like creatures. Given the disturbing nature of these creatures, this has been suggested as a possible explanation for the Dogman. Other theories based in Native American lore focus on the idea of what I'll generally call skinwalkers. Proper skinwalkers come from Navajo tradition, but the concept remains similar. It's an entity that can change into a horrific beast. Or hey, maybe it's just a good old-fashioned old world werewolf hanging out in Michigan, perhaps on vacation. Skeptics, however, see the Dogman as pure urban legend. They note that Steve Cook's viral 1987 song essentially fabricated the modern legend from older tales, a case study in how a good story can snowball. Many supposed sightings can be explained away as misidentifications, with bear misidentifications being a common explanation. A bear standing on its hind legs in the dusk could easily be mistaken for a hairy bipedal monster. People are generally unfamiliar with the ability of bears to stand on their hind legs for extended periods of time, and also walk rather quickly as well. Also, I know some of you are waiting for me to suggest an owl misidentification here, but yeah, it ain't happening this time around. No tangible evidence, bones, tracks, or clear photos, has ever been found to support the Dogman's existence. Further, at least one popular home video, which was provided as proof, was later found to be a hoax. In the midst of suburban Edmond, Oklahoma, tucked behind quiet neighborhoods and ordinary strip malls, lies a patch of overgrown woodland hiding a bizarre secret. Locals whisper that beyond the rusted gate and no trespassing signs are the ruins of an abandoned circus. Imagine walking through tall grass and finding old animal cages, weather-beaten circus trailers, and even a collapsed big-top skeleton. According to legend, this is Gandini's Circus, a once thriving traveling show from the early 20th century that met a mysterious, eerie end. The urban legend of Gandini's Circus paints a vivid and chilling picture. It's said that the circus began touring in the early 1900s, bringing exotic animals and dazzling acts to towns across America. The circus supposedly shut down during the Great Depression, its fortunes lost and its tents abruptly folded for the last time. But unlike most circuses that simply fade away, this one left behind a ghostly imprint. Stories claim that the circus camp on the outskirts of Oklahoma City was abandoned in haste. Visitors to the site recount finding remnants of that era, with charred and burned-out trailers where clowns and carnies once slept. It's as if the echoes of laughter and music got trapped in time, turning the place into an accidental time capsule of a bygone show. What makes Gandini's Circus especially spooky, however, are the tales of sinister occurrences woven into its lore. Over the years, imaginative storytellers have added increasingly eerie elements. In some retellings, evil clowns supposedly prowled these grounds, and a wicked ringmaster is said to have kidnapped people and committed horrors during the circus's last days. Other accounts speak of unfortunate ends for those connected to the circus. Clowns dying in darkly comedic ways, animals left to perish, and the freak show members meeting gruesome fates on the property at the hands of that evil ringmaster. These grisly details are completely unverified, but they amplify the legend's creepiness. The most supernatural versions claim that ghostly apparitions now linger at the old camp. People who dare sneak in at night have reported seeing shadowy figures among the trees and floating spirits roaming the field. Some are human-shaped, while others resemble phantom lions or elephants. Behind the chilling folklore, there are kernels of truth and a fascinating real history that likely gave rise to the circus legend. The physical location is very real, an empty wooded lot in Edmond that indeed holds the remains of a circus winter camp. Throughout the mid-20th century, this property was used as the off-season home for traveling circuses, a place to keep animals and equipment during the winter months. Historical research shows that a man named Howard Seuss acquired a defunct circus's assets in 1943 and established the Clyde Brothers Circus, an indoor arena show. This was successful, and he later acquired the Hagen Brothers Circus, a traditional tented show with animals and other circus attractions that were common at the time. Both circuses made this Oklahoma camp their winter headquarters, housing a menagerie of animals and some performers. By 1976, the circuses had been sold off, and the site, along with its cages, barns, and trailers, was simply left to deteriorate. Overgrown and abandoned for decades, it's easy to see how such a place could spur wild stories. Yet, crucially, researchers have never found any evidence that a circus named Gondini's Circus ever really existed as an official company. A local historian combed through records and turned up nothing on a Gondini troupe. This suggests the name and much of the legend were likely concocted after the fact, perhaps by adventurous locals or imaginative trespassers trying to explain the uncanny ruins. The name Gondini has an old-world ring to it that makes the myth feel believable, even if it's fictitious. Despite the actual truth being obscured, the tale has enough to it to make it a highly interesting urban legend.